I'm going to show you all about something that will change the way you make photos. I'm going to show you black, why we're not using blacks enough, why you're probably not using black enough in your photos, because as I showed you in the recent video showing contrast, the types of contrast, and how different tools can help us edit contrast better and what tool to use when, I'll link that in the comments. In 20 years of being a professional photographer, it took me a long time to really realize, especially in this digital age, even though I started on film, in this digital age, we're always pushing everything into the midtones and saying, oh, we need dynamic range, we need HDR. That's not HDR. HDR needs contrast also. That's another video, but if you guys use my tools and watch my videos, you know that I'm pretty passionate about dynamic range also having contrast, not mushing in to midtones. You can check out the video on contrast, I'll link it. However, today's video is all about blacks, and we're not gonna waste time. We're gonna go right over here and we're gonna start looking at images. We're gonna edit a few images, but I wanna prove my point to you first, is that blacks bring your image to life. Let's go over here and I'm gonna switch to the screen. I'm actually gonna go over to this image that I opened up here, and this is Ansel's Half Dome of Yosemite. Look at the black in this image. I'm gonna go up here, I'm actually going to run the Lumist map. We're not gonna edit this image at all. It's edited just fine. I just wanna show you the zones in this image on the screen, and by running the Lumist map, you can see that we have a visual color-coded representation in real time of the zones from 0 down here in the burgundy all the way to red and clipped. Look at how much black Ansel used in this image. All of this zone 0 pushing all the way down here into these zone 8s and 9s, and even a little bit of zone 10, which is whites. Even a little bit when you zoom in, because this is a very detailed map. When you zoom in, you see some of these white points. Those actually represent pure clipping, the upper 20% of zone 10. Let's hide that, but just look at those blacks. We're going to be looking at some black and white because I think it's easier to see tone in black and white, and it helps us. I love black and white images, but I think it's also a very good learning tool to work in black and white. But it doesn't matter what camera you're using, what software, what tools, what add-ons you're using. All those things might matter in your workflow. They might matter in the style of images and how efficient you are. But blacks are the same in every image. So some lenses have more contrast, right? I like my vintage lenses. They tend to be softer, have a little less contrast than maybe a modern lens. Different cameras, different sensors have different dynamic range, but blacks are a constant. And if you learn to use blacks, it's going to change your photography. I went and I searched amazing black and white. Tell me what you see here. You see a lot of really deep black and really deep white. Even the search engines know that black is critical. Our blacks kind of accentuate everything else. They make everything else pop, including our whites and our colors and everything. But let's actually look at some edit. And I have a few different images because it doesn't matter what we're editing, whether it's street or portrait or landscape. But I'm gonna go in here like I always do and go into the develop mode. And I'm gonna start browsing over some presets, right? Because that's where I'm gonna start. Why? Because look at all the variations I'm getting. I'm here using Silver 4, which is my own black and white preset pack. And I've spent like 15 years refining this pack so that I can quickly go and get the kind of mixes I want. But let's just do something fairly simple like Renaissance. Look what's happening. We're separating the blacks from the whites. We're actually, if you look at the histogram though, we're not truly black. And if you look, there's actually details in our trees and foliage. We're just really pushing those blacks down. And you're gonna see this pattern as we move through. Let's look at a portrait. And if I take something like Silver Skin 2, what's happening? Well, if you look at the histogram, what are we seeing? We're seeing pushed up here. We're not clipping in highlights. We're not clipping in blacks. And that's a good thing. The histogram is very similar to the zones, right? Left is dark, white is light. But look at these different phases of the histogram here in Lightroom, and it doesn't matter where you're looking at the histogram. The upper area of highlights is more or less zone 9, zone 10. The middle highlights is zone 7, zone 8. The midtones is zone 4 to 6 more or less. the mid shadows, zone 3, zone 2, and the low shadows, zone 0 and zone 1. Now, that's important to know because as I've taught zones over the years, there's videos on this channel about zones. There's my expose workshop where we talk about controlling light in all different ways, including zones, metering for zones. All this stuff is important because if we understand zones, we visualize better. We see better here and we get better results in camera, which ultimately gives us better results post-edit. So I think the zones are important, and also understanding the basics of the histogram. It's not so much about being fanatical, right? If I can use a spot meter for a landscape like Ansel did, that's great. But I can also do very similar study of my exposure and what I'm doing in my image by looking at that histogram. I don't trust my screen, right? Because the brightness of that varies by the time of day and all that. But I can trust my histogram to tell me what's happening in those tones. Look at the portrait though here, right? We're not clipping, but we have separation. We have blacks and details in the dress, in the background. Let's just keep going through. Here's an image I wanted to show you. This was taken down on the coast, on the dunes, and you can see we kind of have the jungle encroaching in over here, and we have the trees. Now you could do all this same stuff in color, right? Everything I'm telling you about blacks, we could apply to color. So I could go through and say, oh, this is cool. I'm just gonna up my overall exposure a little bit. And look at how we have blacks over here. They give us lines and contrast. I thought this was kind of a cool image because it represented kind of the beach culture, this town here, people playing on the beach down here in Mexico. And I thought, wow, this is a neat photo. But let's go to black and white for a second and just look at how we can bring out the different looks, right? If we push the blacks, it completely changes the intensity of this image. So I'm going to use pure contrast for really strong contrasty lines and blacks. But we can even go further, and this is something I showed in the recent contrast video. It's not always about the black slider. It's not always about the curves or the levels. Even by changing the greens, for example, right? Look at how the jungle changes when I move the green slider, which changes the atmosphere of how the eye sees it. I don't want this jungle to be pure black. I don't want it too white because I want it to be kind of a dark, mysterious area over here. So I'm going to darken the greens, but then I'm going to separate the foliage a little bit by lightening yellows. Look how it's rimming the contrast. So I'm putting more black in, but I'm not putting black in like this, just darkening it and putting it all to pure clipping black. No, we don't want that. We want detail. We want subtlety in our blacks, but with that subtlety, we want richness. And if you start seeing blacks in that way, it's really going to change how you edit because the black is a foundation to your edit. The black is a foundation to your image, and it doesn't matter whether it's color, whether it's black and white. It doesn't matter whether it's portrait or landscape. Blacks can give you so much. Let's keep looking here. Here's a portrait, right? I can go down and I can say, well, let's take a preset that's gonna look good, and I'm just gonna go through here in Belladonna until I find something that I like, right? Let's do this. It's very subtle. But now I'm gonna push my blacks a little bit more. This is softening the green a little bit. This is doing lots of cool stuff. But let's go down to my curve, and I'm gonna pull my blacks down even more. And look what's happening. It's separating our lights. It's separating our contrast between the two. I don't want to lose her hair. There's still detail in the hair. We still have very nice skin tones, but we're darkening down the surrounding areas. I can even do that with a vignette. I'll use a dark vignette oftentimes to darken my edges a little bit, right? So that I put the focus where I want it to go. And then I can compensate everything with exposure, etc. What am I doing here? I'm editing a way that's not afraid of the blacks, that's not afraid of the contrast, but also being aware that I don't just want to push it willy-nilly. I don't want to do things for no reason. I want to do things with intent. And whether we're doing color in a portrait or whether we're doing black and white in a portrait or landscape, doesn't matter. Let's go to another image, and I want to show you guys a little bit more as we go through. Here's a Cascades image taken in Mexico State. Beautiful location with these terraced cascades. And what better than a waterfall to talk about separation of black and white? So I'm going to go back to just flipping through some presets here, right? So I want to bring out the dynamic range. you can have blacks and still have detail. And I want to show you that with this image as I browse through and I'm looking at different ways that I might process this. I'm going to go HDR Silver 2 on this because look what's happening. We're pushing almost to black, tiny bit of clipping, but not much. We're not clipping the whites. And overall, we just have really good detail in this. I'm just pushing my exposure up a tiny bit here. But look at our histogram. It's a good looking histogram with a lot of range. I like seeing a histogram that uses my tonal range. This is good. This is a good edit, but I can do more with it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to restore the color. So if you see here, this is something I do with silver. I actually have a video on this where all the edits, the tone edits I did, I'm going to leave. The dynamic range I'm going to leave, but I'm going to restore the color here in Lightroom. So I can go Control E, open this image in Photoshop and do a more advanced black and white edit with that color information. And I'm just going to run a black room action. So if I run the black room master tool, it's going to convert my image to black and white and put all these layers in place so that I can quickly edit black and white. It doesn't matter whether you're doing this all manually or whether you're using tools like Blackroom to make it more efficient. The bottom line is control. Look at the zone map on this. You can see we have a lot of zone 1 and we're pushing up into zone 8 with a little bit of zone 9 in the water. I actually want to brighten the water up a little bit, and I want to look here. Even though we're seeing zone 1, let's zoom in. Look at all this zone 1, this burgundy, and let's hide the map. We actually still have detail. So there's richness in blacks, but there's a little bit of highlight popping out here and there, a little bit of midtone. And what that's allowing us to do is not just have these huge vacuum areas that are all black that just kind of suck the eye in. We want the eye to kind of roam through and follow through whatever scene it is and go to our subject. That's the goal of how we use tone. So what happens here? Now I could run any one of these, right? I could control how compressed my black and white conversion is and how it interprets the black and white, because Photoshop has a lot of tools that Lightroom doesn't. And I've built those into Blackroom, and that's why I go into Photoshop for a more advanced edit. But what I'm actually going to do, because I have other videos showing how Blackroom works on this channel, I'm just going to go here, and you can see me go down. I'm going to manually add a curves layer to this. Okay, so we put in a plain curves layer right here. What I'm going to do with this curves layer is I'm just going to push up my highlights a little bit. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to turn on the map again so I can see my zones in real time rather than my actual image. And you can see as I edit this, it's actually changing the map. So this is cool because it gives me feedback. This is the map that I have in Blackroom as well as in Lumist that I designed so I could have a more direct feedback of our zones. So I'm going to keep our zone 1 and our zone 2, keep those shadows, right? But push those lights up a little bit to bring a little bit more into that, and pull this curve down here a little bit, just so we have a nice roll off on the high highlights. I don't want to be pushing into reds and whites. I don't want to be clipping. I just want to have nice, rich highlights. So you can see here, none of this is clipping. This is all 7, 8, 9 on the water, and 0, 1, 2, 3 in the shadows. Let's hide that zone map and look at the actual image and look at what's happening here with our curves layer. What we're doing is we're pushing the water. I'm going to pull my blacks down a little bit more, but I'm going to lift right here on the lower end. See, if I grab the low blacks, I can lift them a little up or down and control how much detail. So I'm going to put a little bit of detail back into those low blacks so we maintain that dynamic range like we set up in Lightroom. And then I'm just going to kind of balance that out, right? How much black versus how much white. And you can see we have this image with just all this detail from almost pure black to almost pure white. And frankly, I think it looks pretty good. So if we look at this that we just did in Photoshop versus the other one in Lightroom, looked good, right? This is a great image, and maybe some of you like this better, but that's not really the point here. I'm going for a contrasty look on this image. I want those blacks, but despite what your eye may be telling you to glance, just like Half Dome, there's still detail in those blacks. And if we know how to see what we're trying to make, if we know how to see the zones, right? This image that was taken down in Tamasopo of the waterfalls in the jungle. And you've probably seen this before. I've done other videos talking about it, but look what's happening here. We're separating, using color channels, using contrast. This is actually just a raw edit. Let's look at the raw file. This isn't even taken into Photoshop. This is just a conversion with silver for and a little bit of tweaking, right? So my raw file, beautiful scene, beautiful soft light that morning, a little bit underexposed, right? You see I should push up the exposure a little bit, which I did. I pushed the exposure by 1 stop in my edit, but then I pushed in with those blacks. Look at the histogram up here. We're leaning towards low key. We're leaning towards dark, but not clipping in those blacks. We're down all the way to zone 0, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And then on the other end, we're not clipping the whites, but we do have some highlight coming in. And look at how it brings out the texture and the foliage. Blacks are your friend. And if you start pushing and start being intimidated by putting some black in your photos, don't think everything needs to be like at a glance, like, oh, there's great detail there. If I'm putting blacks in, I might say, wow, that's black. But then I look close and I'm like, there's a little bit of detail in there. That's somebody that knew where to put their blacks. That's somebody that knew that they wanted black, but they didn't want the vacuum of space. They wanted controlled blacks. And those controlled blacks accent every other part of our contrast. They accent our whites and our midtones. They make our middle gray actually seem brighter by contrast. Just like when you buy a TV, they're always talking about contrast ratio and black ratio and things like that. Because when the blacks have richness, they actually kick off all the other tones regardless of whether you're in color or whether you're in black and white. Okay, you guys, I hope you found this useful. I hope you liked it. If you do, hit that sub button, hit that bell icon. If you want to see any of the products I'm using, Silver or Blackroom, if any of that stuff interests you, head over to my site, seimfx.com. I'll link it along with the other things I mentioned. Once you start using blacks, your photography will change forever. Just like I've told you before, once you start using zones and understanding those zones, like I've said in other videos, your photography changes forever. All these little things come together to give us a deep understanding of how we use light, because at the end of the day, we're painting with that light. And if you look at the masters, if you look at the master black and white, the master colors, even if you go back to the painters, I learned a lot by studying the painters. I love the landscapes from the Hudson River School. If you go back to that, you'll even see rich, deep blacks being used in those paintings from the masters before photography even existed. And so as we paint with light, let's not forget the blacks. All right, you guys, peace. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.